So I think it's a great idea to separate out what is controversial about vaccines and has always been controversial, which is that it's almost more of a sociological approach. Like if I was a sociologist studying vaccine resistance, there'd be a lot for me to mine there. But legally, and Larry and Art, feel free to disagree, in some ways, the law around vaccines has felt a little bit like a backwater, just because the law has been relatively settled in terms of states having broad police powers to enforce public health initiatives. Employers in this country are mostly at will, so they have a lot of leeway to require things such as getting vaccinations. Schools, obviously, the pendulum swings back and forth between allowing more or fewer exemptions, but schools can require and have been able to since 1922 vaccines in order to attend schools. So legally, I'm not sure that this is controversial, but I respect the fact that for a lot of people, there's a lot of emotions attached to what do I put in my body, what do I put in the body of my loved ones, and so it may feel more controversial to them.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 10th season of the Jonathan Saman Hot Button School Conversations series. I'm Mark Sokol, President and CEO here at JCC Greater Boston. This series invites distinguished public figures to engage with each other and with us around controversial and difficult subjects. An expert moderator leads our panelists in discussion on issues of concern to the Jewish community and certainly well beyond. Our hallmark is respectful and civil dialogue and conversation. We are thrilled, as always, to partner with WGBH for tonight's program, examining COVID culture wars. The COVID surge driven by the Delta variant is finally starting to recede in much of the United States. But as winter looms, experts warn more vaccinations are needed to keep the virus at bay. The CDC says about 56% of the US population is fully vaccinated, making this largely a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Mask mandates and vaccine requirements have become as much political controversy as a global health crisis. Tonight, we examine how masking and vaccines have become a partisan, hot-button issue over individual liberties, personal accountability, and responsibility for one another, our community. We have a very distinguished panel tonight, all of whom seem to have deep roots at the JCC in a variety of ways, which I was thrilled to learn as we were chatting before we went live. First, let me introduce Art Caplan, Professor of Bioethics at New York University, Langone Medical Center. Dr. Caplan is the founding director of the Division of Medical Ethics. He's created a working group on coronavirus vaccine challenge studies and developed an ethical framework for distributing drugs and vaccines. He has written more than 30 books, including Vaccination, Ethics, and Policy. Next, let me introduce Larry Gostin, Professor in Global Health Law at Georgetown University. Mr. Gostin is the founding O'Neill Chair in Global Health Law at Georgetown. He directs the World Health Organization's Center on Global Health Law and is working with the WHO on the global COVID-19 response. And finally, Carmel Shachar, Executive Director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology and Bioethics at Harvard Law School. She is also a lecturer at the law school, where she teaches a course on healthcare rights in the 21st century. Carmel's work focuses on the application of public health ethics to real-world questions. She has a forthcoming book called COVID-19 and the Law. Moderating tonight's panel is David Graham. David is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where he covers politics and criminal justice, among many other topics. His coverage of the 2020 presidential election won the 2021 Toner Prize for Excellence in National Political Reporting. He previously reported for Newsweek and the Wall Street Journal. As we begin our program, as always, this our 10th season of programs, we'd like to thank our donors. Without your financial support, we would not be able to produce tonight's programs and the rest of the programs that we will bring to you this year. We appreciate your commitment to fulfilling the mission and the vision of both the Hot Button School Conversations series and our JCC. Tonight's program is being recorded and produced in partnership, as I said, with WBGH. Now let me turn things over to our moderator, David Graham. David, all yours.
Mark, thank you for that. Thank you to the panelists for being here. Thank you to the audience. This is a topic that unfortunately probably requires very little introduction at this stage. I think it feels for many of us like we are having to be experts every day on medicine and on ethics and on the law. And so it's refreshing to have a chance to actually talk to experts on those topics. So I'm going to go right to you guys. And just to keep things simple with a really narrowly focused, easy question. If we're in a culture war here, who is winning and who is losing? Art, you laughed, so I'm going to go to you first.
Well, I think we are in a bit of a culture war because there are uncertainties about many aspects of COVID, how to control it, what's going to happen in the future. And I think ideology kind of tends to rush in there where there's a vacuum in the evidence or the facts. It's certainly a disease in my long-lived years that I've never seen anything as politicized as this. Larry and I both remember AIDS. I think this is worse in some ways than what was going on with HIV and AIDS in terms of the politicization. But I think we are in a culture war in the sense in which scientific and medical authority under attack, many people asserting, if you will, in courts, rights such as getting the doctor to prescribe a medicine that they want, but the doctor doesn't think is appropriate. We've got fights going on between nationalism in the US and other countries and what the rest of the world needs that are heavily political. And I'll point a finger. I think Donald Trump did a pretty good job politicizing COVID research and the response to COVID in the form of vaccination. And that tuned up, if you will, part of the conservative and Republican, I'm going to call it opposition in many ways to public health recommendations. So yeah, I would say my answer would be yes.
Larry, do you agree that this is the most politicized public health issue you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, I think it compares to AIDS. I mean, we have to remember during AIDS, Ronald Reagan and then, Bush barely mentioned the word. And the stigma was, I think, worse. The activism was stronger with ACT UP. But this is, this is unprecedented in the sense that, there's a loss of trust in public health agencies, particularly the CDC, FDA, who we think to get a new commissioner soon, and the World Health Organization. There've been conflicting recommendations. And so I think, beyond a culture war, there is actually, a crisis of confidence in public health and in science that in some ways is much more troubling to me. And it's impossible to say who's winning the culture war. Obviously, the vast majority of America, thinks that COVID is real, believes in the vaccine. But you have a very large vocal minority, and this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated in the United States. And, we need to get more tools. We're going to be talking, I'm sure, David, about all the mandates, and particularly the 3 Biden mandates. I do think that that's going to, really get us out of an impasse, maybe not high enough, but I think mandates may actually melt away the opposition to COVID vaccines rather than the reverse, as it's claimed.
Carmel, let's actually take that question of vaccines up right there. We have these mandates, increasingly we have private sector mandates, we have public sector mandates, but we had the president come out today and say that, the number of people who we still have is unvaccinated is unacceptable. And we continue to see big conflicts over this. We see, public employees unions refusing to do things, demanding mass exemptions. We have rumors of sort of unannounced strikes. Are the vaccine mandates working in that respect? And is that a way out of the impasse?
So I think it is. I think, frankly, for every time you try to move somebody, you can either use a carrot or a stick, right? And I think when the vaccines initially rolled out, we tried to use a lot of different carrots. The first carrot is you get this vaccine, you are not going to die of COVID. That's a pretty good carrot, actually. But then you heard stories about Krispy Kreme offering free donuts if you got a vaccine, some employers even offering some money, all of these encouragements to say, get the vaccine, get the vaccine. And we saw that convinced a slice of the population who maybe might not have gotten the vaccine, although I'm not sure how many people were really ultimately moved by a Krispy Kreme donut. But we're now at the point where everybody who hasn't gotten the vaccine is carrot immune. Whatever we're offering them is just not a big enough carrot. And so if the carrot doesn't work, in some regards, you need to say this goal is important enough to us because of the economic toll, the social toll, let alone the thousands and thousands of deaths, that we need to accomplish the goal of meaningfully vaccinating our population. And so in come the sticks, in come the mandates.
And the sort of reaction to these mandates has been very strong. We see people saying that they're a vast infringement on civil liberties and so on and so forth. Just talking about it legally, and Carmel, maybe you can start with this too. Is there anything new about the kind of mandates we're seeing, or is this more of the same? What are we to make of this kind of rhetoric about liberty when we come to vaccines?
So I think it's a great idea to separate out what is controversial about vaccines and has always been controversial, which is that it's almost more of a sociological approach. Like if I was a sociologist studying vaccine resistance, there'd be a lot for me to mine there. But legally, and Larry and Art, feel free to disagree, in some ways, the law around vaccines has felt a little bit like a backwater just because the law has been relatively settled in terms of states having broad police powers to enforce public health initiatives. Employers in this country are mostly at will, so they have a lot of leeway to require things such as getting vaccinations. Schools, obviously, the pendulum swings back and forth between allowing more or fewer exemptions, but schools can require and have been able to since 1922 vaccines in order to attend schools. So legally, I'm not sure that this is controversial, but I respect the fact that for a lot of people, there's a lot of emotions attached to what do I put in my body? What do I put in the body of my loved ones? And so it may feel more controversial to them from that perspective.
One thing I would say is a little different about COVID vaccination is not so much mandates. We've seen mandates around, certainly for many vaccines for school kids, and there are even some mandates around for different jobs, but a mass mandate for adults, that's a little different. We haven't really had that sort of a phenomena taking place. I'm tempted to say it's a little easier to get the poor kids vaccinated than it is a rowdy adult. The state is sort of looking out for the kids and they kind of trump in terms of their interests. But I would make two comments. One, in the culture, going back to culture wars, I don't know where we got this strain of what I'm going to call Ayn Rand type libertarianism. It's sort of, I do what I want. No one can tell me what to do. I'm free every minute. And it's sort of like, no, you're not. That's not the society we've ever had. And there wouldn't be a society if we had that notion of crude, let's call it libertarianism. The other thing that I find troubling is less concern for community. People seem more self-interested in the culture war. We often appeal and say, protect the community, protect one another, help your neighbor. And I do get people sort of responding to that morally saying, no, I don't care. I don't have to do that. I don't want to do that. And it's, I think it's wrong. I mean, it's just flat out an incorrect moral position, but there it is. So that, to me, adults getting pushed to vaccinate, coming up with their freedom arguments, that is a little different from kids and the mandate situation historically.
Larry, you've referred to vaccination as a sort of greater freedom. Can you explain what you mean by that?
I can, and then I want to give a little explanatory addition to what Carmel and Art said. Both I agree with. So, there's a vocal minority, as I said earlier, that seems to suggest that, I have a freedom not to be vaccinated. And in a recent JAMA article, I made the argument that actually mandatory vaccinations are a wider freedom because, most of us want to be free to go back to all the things that we love. We want to go back to cafes and restaurants with our friends and our family. We want to go to movie theaters, concerts. We want to fly without fear. There is a philosophical tradition of multiple freedoms, famously FDR's freedom from fear. And most of us want to feel confident and safe and go back to what we love. And we can do that much more safely and with a feeling of greater confidence if everyone around us is vaccinated. So at Georgetown Law and Georgetown University per se, we have over 99% vaccination rate of our entire community. So I go into work and I feel relatively comfortable, but I wouldn't in a large crowded setting like that if I didn't feel that everybody was vaccinated, and in fact, we're also masked. But whenever you would like, David, I can really explain more about the legal side of it.
Please go ahead.
Okay. So, Carmel is absolutely right. There's a very robust judicial acceptance, including 2 Supreme Court opinions that upheld, very broad police powers of state and local governments to vaccinate. These powers have extended, from children through to adults. The adult vaccination was very much a part of our history, but it hasn't been since the latter part of the 20th century. And so the adult part, as Art has really correctly said, is somewhat new, but it's not controversial or new legally. But what is new? So essentially, states have broad power to require vaccinations under their so-called police powers, their public health powers. And as Amy said, employers, particularly at-will employers, can set terms and conditions. President Biden's orders are new and fairly unprecedented, and they don't rest on the legal authority of states because it's the federal government under the Constitution has limited authority. But I do believe, and I've written in Scientific American, that this is that Biden is on rock solid legal ground. I won't go through all of his 3 mandates, but the third, the most controversial, is the large business one. OSHA has just submitted its emergency temporary standard to OMB for clearance, and we should see it very, very soon. But there, Biden is at the height of his presidential authority because he's not acting unilaterally or under executive order. He's acting with the explicit authorization of the Congress of the United States of America through the Occupational Safety and Health Act. And so I hope and I expect the courts to uphold that. My one concern with the Supreme Court, the big wild card, is on religious freedom. You'll recall, many of you might recall, that the Supreme Court twice struck down COVID emergency powers because it applied to worshipers. That could be very dangerous for the future of public health going forward.
Let me jump in with one comment there. So some people have said to me, you can't have a mandate that doesn't respect the right to exempt out on religious grounds. That is a funny statement, especially for me, because I spent the past couple of years pre-COVID trying to get a few states to remove the religious exemption from their mandates for kids for the kid shots. basically saying you can't use a religious exemption to opt out of a key public health protection. California, New York, Maine, and where I am in Connecticut all took out the religious exemption from
as well as West
law.
Virginia and Mississippi, two red.
Well, they had it. They even had it earlier.
They had it long
they
ago.
They were like 20 years ago with this. There's an interesting tale why West Virginia and Mississippi. The short answer is they had very aggressive public health departments that sort of no one opposed at the time, and off they went. In any event, I completely agree with Larry. The religious exemption fight and issue is really the weak underbelly when it comes to trying to get mandates, because the broader you are with that exemption, the more people can just say, last night, the Holy Ghost visited me and said, no more vaccination, and I'm out. Or the Supreme Court has to take a stand on something it hates, which is what is a legitimate religious belief. But I'll say from a moral point of view, getting a sudden onset belief that you don't like vaccines on religious grounds strikes me as implausible. I will also say that every religion I've surveyed does not oppose vaccination. Even Christian Science, near where many of our participants are today in Boston, I've talked to the main church, they've never condemned vaccination. They make it a matter of conscience. So you won't find statements. In fact, you'll find the contrary. Catholic Church says get vaccinated. Pope says get vaccinated. Organized religion coming down pretty hard, pro-vaccine. So you've got a situation where what's an authentic religious belief? What counts as quote unquote a religious belief, if you're just saying it's conscience, is a court going to say, okay, that's religious? And you can hear from again, I'm doing the ethics end here. I don't have to worry about the legality of the whole thing, but I don't like the notion that insincere, inauthentic claims are made in the name of religion to work your way out of a mandate. Morally, that just strikes me as offensive.
Okay, well let me play. Oh, go ahead, Carmel.
David, if I could jump in for a moment and build on what Art said. I think that he's really hit the nail on the head as to what is one of the most interesting developments, which is beforehand, the formula was always, okay, a religious exemption, you need to show us a sincerely held religious belief. But nobody really wanted to dig too closely into whether a belief was actually sincerely held. It was basically like, well, you said words with your mouth, therefore you've met that bar pretty much. And now I think we're seeing a lot of really interesting pushback. I think probably a lot of people have seen it's gone a little bit viral on the internet. A health system, I think Conway Health, sent out a form to its employees saying, okay, you're objecting to the COVID vaccines because fetal cells were kind of tangentially involved in developing these vaccines. Do you also refuse these medications on the same basis? And it's like a list of extremely standard garden variety, like Tylenol kind of level medications. And I think having more and more employers say, okay, you say that you need a religious exemption, prove it to me. I think that's going to be an interesting flashpoint. And I wouldn't be surprised if the courts ultimately do have to articulate a better standard of how do we evaluate if a belief is indeed sincerely held.
Hey, David, just one more comment on this. Is a real chestnut for me, sorry. And I've got two lawyers here, so I'm ready to watch them laugh this idea out. But when I was a younger man back in the 16th century, somebody may remember we had something called the Vietnam War. And a lot of people did not want to honor a mandate, which was a compulsory draft to serve in that war. And many people objected and said they had religious objection or conscientious objection to the mandate. And we set up draft boards. People had to make their case in front of a body of people to say why their argument was legitimate, authentic, sincere, deeply held. Many of them were turned down. Some were accepted. But maybe that's an area, having boards, having some mechanism to evaluate a claim. I mean, no lawyer here, but that is sort of a precedent to thinking about how to weigh a religious claim of exemption.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I think that the same people. Oh,
No,
I
you
was
go
going to say,
ahead.
I think the same people who would want the religious exemption and object to COVID-19 vaccine mandates are probably people who may have uttered the word death panel a couple times. And so I agree. I think that's a logically good way to say, okay, let's get people who are sensitive and thoughtful and trained to evaluate. But I think it goes back to the discussion that we had earlier with the culture wars, where that's not going to be satisfying for the people who are on the internet Googling horse dewormers and how do you submit the paperwork for religious exemptions. Sorry to interrupt you, Larry.
What we have is a wholesale erosion of faith in any kind of authority, public health authority, anybody else. And that seems like the more fundamental problem. And I don't know how we rebuild that. If people don't trust any authority, where do we even start to get them around to the idea that this might be worthwhile and that someone might have their best interests in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I've written about this a lot. I mean, it's a really important question, David, and I don't know that we have a really strong answer to it. There's absolutely been an erosion of trust in science, public health, and in particular public health agencies. I mentioned CDC, WHO, and the FDA as three, key agencies. And even, a very, very close friend of mine who's been, at the forefront of Zika, MERS, influenza, AIDS, Tony Fauci, himself has been controversial, and he's had to have a, security detail. I mean, imagine that, somebody who's a national treasure and has worked so hard for the public's health and safety would feel threatened, even if you disagreed with him. And I think we've all gotten these. I've certainly gotten messages, not to the extent that Tony has, but many. So, how do you build back trust? Part of it is, a lot of people blame social media, and certainly, unlike, there have been falsities and around all the outbreaks and epidemics, but there was never a kind of an amplifier, a mouthpiece like social media. That's part of the problem, but it's not all of the problem. Our political leaders, as Art mentioned, Donald Trump, really did undermine science. Biden is very pro-science, but he's also made a lot of mistakes. He announced a booster program and got out way ahead of his public health agency. And the two directors, the commissioner and the director, acting commissioner, the director of CDC and FDA, they signed on to the Biden statement without kind of acquiescence of their career scientists. And so, we were predicting for a long time that there would be uproar among the career scientists and also among the independent FDA and CDC advisors. That's exactly what happened. And now the public is, dazed and confused about, boosters. Just today, the FDA decided on Moderna boosters. It's, Johnson and Johnson. Are we, do you get a second dose of J&J or do you get an mRNA second dose? Because there are studies that show that you get a more robust response with messenger RNA vaccines. At the same time, people have voted with their feet, and already millions of people have got boosters even before they were authorized. So it's an absolute chaos out there. And no wonder the public, just feels confused. For a start, I think that public health agencies need to, hire good health communicators. CDC's acted like a science think tank rather than anything else. I mean, I could go on. I mean, it's guidance on whether what vaccinated people could do changed 3 times in about 6 weeks, and so the public just doesn't understand. We have to just do a better job of gaining their trust. But this is a hard one, David. It really is. And and I believe you are exactly right. This is at the core of our problem now. But the bigger and more worrying thing is what will happen in the future, in the next epidemics, if we continue along this path.
So I'm going to suggest, to reinforce Larry's comments here, it's crucial to regaining trust that scientists don't act as religious figures and believe that people are going to do what they say based on their scientific authority. That world has left us. You're not going to just get up there, maybe as happened in the polio epidemic, and say, I'm Jonas Salk, this thing works, I have a white coat, line up. And people did. And I think that trust has shifted. We have to not only get more communicators, but we've got to train them. Listen, if I went to an NYU lab today and said to the lab director, I'm going to take your best students out of here an hour a week for 4 weeks to talk to them about scientific communication, being good citizens in their community, trying to engage their neighbors and friends with public health and scientific questions, they'd laugh at me. They won't let me have any time to do that sort of thing with, and so, no disrespect to Tony Fauci, I agree, is a national hero. We need about 50 times as many spokespeople from the sciences and medicine to get engaged. They got to be doing it at the community level. That's where the culture war is being fought. It's at the school board. It's not so much necessarily all Washington. So I'll let that go, but it's local often, not just something taking place in DC. And the other thing I would say to regaining trust is we need to engage the religious community in more messaging and more communication. Many Americans, like it or not, turn to religious leaders for their values and their guidance. I don't hear the loud voices of religion. I hear people saying, I have objections, I don't want to do things in the name of religion. But I don't see mainstream religion working with science loudly, sending messages in the evangelical circles, or you can pick your place. I mean, the Pope has spoken out some, and that's great. But America is a very religious country. It just is. And you've got to get trust by merging respect for science with the religious voices, I believe. So I think culturally, that's one way back to the communitarianism that we're missing.
So there's a supply and demand question here. You can supply a bunch of much more skilled public health communicators, but you've also got people who have decided they're going to do their own research. And it turns out on Twitter, they heard about this great new product that's used for horses, and it's a miracle drug. And they've done their own research, and they're pretty sure it's what they should do instead of, they're going to get that instead of getting the vaccine. How are you going to reach those people?
Well, for me, part of it is to not have courts ordering that they have to get that drug if that's what they want. That's a complete misunderstanding of how medicine works. It's not a menu in a restaurant. You don't go in and say, hey, ivermectin. I saw that on the internet. They won't give it to me. Judge, will you order them to do it? To which the answer has to be no. You have to defer to expertise about what individual healthcare providers and their institutions think is within medical limits to give. So I get the sense, and here I'll blame the law, when I see judges gearing up to order treatments, I find myself thinking you're undermining medical authority.
Carmel, what can we do about that on the legal side?
Well, so before I have a suggestion on the legal side, I wanted to say, and this might come off as a little bit strange, that the woman on the panel is maybe advocating for turning up the dial a little bit on medical paternalism. But I think in some regards, there was a very rightful pushback against medical paternalism, saying people should really be captains of their own ship and be able to determine what is the right course of treatment for them. But I think the pendulum has swung a little bit too far to the other side to say, okay, you can hear what your doctor says, but then you can also do your own research by scrolling on Facebook and scrolling on Instagram. And you see it in other aspects of medicine besides COVID vaccination. So for example, the reports of so-called free birth communities on Facebook and Instagram where women egg each other on to not engage with any medical professionals, to just give birth at home. And these groups actually ban their members from telling somebody, hey, maybe you should get checked out by a doctor. You know, you've been in labor for a really long time. Maybe you should go to the hospital. So I think there needs to be a cultural conversation of, yes, you should be able to determine what's the right course of medical treatment for yourself. But at a certain point, you know, patients, we often refer to patients as consumers in healthcare advocacy, but a patient is not a consumer of healthcare the way that I am a consumer of yoga pants or whatever people's vice was during the pandemic, delivered bottles of wine, fancy chocolates, etc. And there needs to be more of an acknowledgement that when your physician says, I'm not giving this to you, it's dangerous, it's not proven to help, that you listen to that. And when your physician says you are at risk or your community has really high transmission rates, you need to get this vaccine, that that person is listened to and respected as somebody who's been trained and has medical
Carmel,
authority.
Just to reinforce that point, I think one of the worst things that has ever happened in this country is direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising. It says things like, ask your doctor if you want this drug, ask for X, and remind your doctor if you have comorbidities. What the hell kind of doctor have you got if you have to go in and say, I have comorbidities, and moreover, you probably haven't heard about this, but I watched it on TV and they said it was a good thing for me. I mean, that is the kind of consumeristic, the old language used to be, where's the learned intermediary? But I hate the notion of advertising complicated drugs directly to the public so that they can go out and nag their doctor for what they want. I think it's undermining medical authority.
Blame the Supreme Court and Congress. I can blame the Supreme Court for just about everything. I can give you a list if you like.
We'd be here all night.
Well, speaking of court battles to come, we've got another kind of mandates. We see, for example, Governor Greg Abbott in Texas issuing these sort of anti-mandates, mandates meant to ban mandates. You cannot comply with a federal mask mandate, for example. And so, in some ways, this is formally on its surface similar, kind of pernicious. What are we to make of that kind of counter mandate?
Well, I can start if you like, unless Carmel or Art would like to. Also, David,
Carmel wants no part of it.
Okay, no, she would be able to answer very well. And also, I should say, we should also talk about school mandates with the 5 to 12 issue coming up by Halloween. It's really an apt time to do that. The answer to that is that, first of all, I think Greg Abbott is acting as if he's the king of Texas rather than the elected governor, because I don't know what legislative authority he's acting under. He might be acting under an emergency health powers, but he's doing exactly the opposite. But beyond that, even if his order were lawful, it's very clear that under the Supremacy Clause, as the Texas Airlines have already said, that you abide by the federal rule, not by the state one. So I think it's a political show. It's one of the examples, David, of the kinds of politicization that you've been talking about, but it's a very clear one. You've got about 10 states, all very red, that have done things that are against everything we know about responding to COVID-19. And I've seen in the past with many epidemics or outbreaks, states failing to do something important. But it's very rare, if ever, that states actually block you from doing something that's really important for the public's health and safety. I've often said that, our political leaders they really have only a single priority. Because a lot of things we can do for ourselves, but what we can't do for ourselves, what we need a collectivity for, is to guarantee our health and safety. There's no higher call to duty in a democracy than making everyone safe. I would also add making everyone equitable and fair and equal. We've done a miserable job with both.
Art and Carmel, do you want to, any thoughts on these anti-mandates as well?
Well, I mean, I can be succinct. I think that the governor is an idiot. He doesn't have the authority. He can't issue an executive order based on what? I mean, what's the argument that I mandate that there can be no mandates? It seems to me as empty as can be, and morally, it's obviously inconsistent with what's going to protect his own citizenry. I'll add something else. Aside from the fight about OSHA in Washington, we've had plenty of mandates in place before Biden's policy. They've been built on the idea that employers are at will. They can hire and fire people for all kinds of reasons, including you're not vaccinated. In Texas, I'm waiting for the business community to say, you mean we don't have the right to hire and fire as we want? We can't discriminate, but didn't we used to have a lot of power and authority? Plus, workplace safety, and our lawyer friends know this better than me, but I know a little bit, has always been something that employers and unions have fought to establish. You don't have to worry about OSHA. You can still say, I can't operate my business because I got to travel overseas like the airlines and they're going to make me vaccinate. So it's integral to my business that we be vaccinated. I can't function otherwise. Or I work in a nursing home, I work in a prison, I work in a confined congregate housing setting. It's too dangerous. We're all going to it's the same argument. You got to wear goggles, you got to wear a hard hat. If I look at the governor's mandate, I'm thinking, throw away your protective gear, do what you want with respect to goggles. I don't really care if you wear the booties, no hard hats anymore here, because it's all up to you, no more mandates.
Well, Larry brought up a great question, which is vaccines for 5 to 12, which we have coming around the bend. And I've heard from parents who have never anticipated anything as hotly as they're so ready for these vaccines, and others who were quick to get the vaccine themselves and are nervous about vaccinating their children. It's a really complicated question. So, we have questions of what the data is and how the authorization works, and when we should be starting in them and how people should assess that. Carmel, do you want to take that to begin?
Yeah, so I will first really disclose my bias. I have in the next rooms a 2-year-old and a 4-month-old that I joke with my friends at Moderna. I'm like, oh, if you have any pediatric vaccines lying around, but no, seriously, if you do, feel free to drop them off at my house. I think that parents may find it a little bit discomforting. Oh, this vaccine didn't exist like a year and change ago, and now I'm being asked to put it in my child's body. But fundamentally, the safety profile of these vaccines is very, very good. The technology they've been built on has been around for a while. And again, as we've discussed, school mandates are really not anything new. You can kind of go back and forth about whether if something's approved under an EUA, can it be mandated? There's some ink spilled. I'm of the belief that you can still mandate, even though there's a few things you can hang your hat on to say maybe you can't mandate if it's under an EUA as opposed to full approval. But that's ultimately a red herring too, because very quickly these things are going to get moved from EUA to full approval. And once they're fully approved, legally, there's nothing really to distinguish it from all the other vaccines that schools require. They're all fully FDA approved. The law doesn't distinguish between, okay, it took this long to develop the MMR that you're taking, and it's been this long since we've been giving MMR shots, that's the newness and speed by which it was developed is not legally relevant once it's been approved.
You know, we're talking trust. The most trusted people with respect to vaccination of children are pediatricians. We have to get them ready to answer questions. Is this going to be dangerous long-term for my kid? If it's only sort of modestly approved under an EUA, what does that mean? Can you explain it to me? By the way, there are at least 6 billion people who've gotten vaccines to some way or another. I'd say the data set's pretty good about safety and efficacy, but I'd want to be preparing right now with those pediatricians. One place parents go to get answers is to that source. And I think they're trusted, and I still think they're authoritative. It doesn't mean they're going to persuade everyone or win over everybody to vaccinate, but I think there is a place where science and medicine have strong spokespeople.
I've got about 90 minutes more questions for the panel. And unfortunately, I don't have 90 minutes to ask them. Plus, we have a bunch of great questions coming in from the audience. So I'm going to turn to a few of those questions if that works for the panel. Here's a place to start. You know, this conversation has been pretty, a lot of comedy in this conversation. Everyone seems to agree in the broad strokes, but many people know someone who doesn't agree with them. And those conversations can quickly turn in a very tense direction. So do you have any tips on how people might talk to friends or family members or coworkers who disagree on questions of mask mandates or vaccines in a way that is going to be productive?
Well, I don't. I've abandoned all those. No, no, I mean, a couple of things. Obviously, confrontation, not the best way to go. Usually I try in conversations to make an appeal to protect me, protect somebody who's vulnerable, look out for people that you and I both know, the kid who's sick or the individual who's just had a transplant, they can't protect themselves. I really hope that, you know, we could all do the right thing to help those people. I'm trying to look for common ground and a desire that they might have to look out for the vulnerable. I don't usually just say, you know, I think it, but I don't say, what are you nuts? We're going to have this wedding and we're not going to have a vaccination requirement to get in and a mask requirement, which just happened to me. Just had one of those weddings. And I said, you know, at least we could say we have testing at the door. At least we could say we'd like to see your vaccination card in order to protect a very vulnerable group of older people that might be here. So I'm looking to appeal to their better nature. I guess Carmel would say I'm looking for a few carrots.
For the lawyers, someone asked, you know, is there a possibility that politicians who have acted in ways that I think we've been describing as irresponsible could be held legally liable for deaths on their watch or for the kind of choices they're making on public health?
Do you want to go, Carmel? I mean, I'm happy to let you go first.
Oh, thank you, Larry. I appreciate that. I think I would be very, very surprised. I mean, politicians make decisions that, whether or not they're well-meaning, lead to less optimal outcomes, human suffering, death, all the time. In general, the only time that we really hold politicians accountable is sort of when there's been like an armed conflict and we start talking about things like war crimes. I think here, while a lot of people have a hand in how rapidly COVID spread, how we kind of got caught flat-footed in so many ways, and I think we could have kept the death toll a lot lower, I don't think that politicians will face legal repercussions for the choices that they made. Larry, what do you think?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think it's very unlikely because so long as the political leader is acting colorably within her or his scope of office, I think that they're very strongly protected legally. It's very, very hard for me to see that they would that they would be liable. That's not to say that their orders couldn't be challenged and shouldn't be, and many will be overturned, including the Abbott one, I think, that we referred to earlier. But I think holding a politician personally liable for decisions that she makes is not legally viable, and I don't think it necessarily should be legally viable in a democracy like ours.
David, I wrote an article way back when the measles outbreak was taking place, pre-COVID, back in Disneyland, and we were worried about spread, that if you could show an individual infected your kid and the kid was harmed, there might be liability that way. That has ever since produced wonderfully colorful emails to me from many who don't like that idea. But I still believe, and I wrote it with a couple of attorneys who believed, it's hard sometimes to prove the cause, but we have had instances where someone was known to be COVID positive, showed up somewhere, other people got sick, and some had to at least undergo hospital care. Liability there?
Have any of you seen legitimate reasons why somebody might have hesitations about a mask mandate or a vaccine mandate? And maybe as an adjunct to that, I'd say, is there a point where someone might be concerned about civil liberties here? You know, something Larry, for example, pointed out that the Biden orders are unprecedented, but on firm legal ground. But when we start looking at new precedents and civil liberties, is there any reason for people to be concerned and on their guard about those things?
Well, I mean, some people suggest that if we allow all this government authority, that we're headed more down the road to a fascist state. It won't stop. There'll be, who knows what they'll be mandating next. Perhaps banning critical race theory in the classroom, he said, ironically. But it seems to me, if anything, we've tried to go gingerly down the road of government power. I don't find the argument that mandates mean, you know, we're going to wind up with totalitarianism next year. If anything, I think we've tried to, you know, we started to educate, then we tried to incentivize, then we went to mandates. We have, in a sense, tried to listen hard to people who dissent and have objections. So I don't see that as a real worry, although it's certainly one I think we need to explain all the time.
Yeah, I mean, the thing, you know, getting back to the wider freedom, David, you know, I mean, I talked about a wider freedom, but, you know, I think that there are at least two kinds of freedom. You know, one is, you know, kind of a freedom from fear, a wider freedom. Another is the right to individual autonomy, and autonomy, of course, absolutely includes the right to make your own decisions about your own bodily integrity. I very much support that. But under any conception of ideas of liberalism, or even in conservative ideas of externalities, no one has ever said that somebody has a protected civil liberty to do something that harms others. And the key issue around vaccine mandates isn't whether they're safe and effective. A person is absolutely entitled to reject a safe and effective intervention. But what she doesn't have the right to do is expose others. So you don't have a right to go unvaccinated and unmasked in a crowded workplace. And that's really an important distinction. You know, my liberty ends at the point where I'm going to harm you. And there's some awfully good data that shows that while vaccination does not fully prevent you from transmitting SARS-CoV-2 to others, it so significantly curtails that risk as to justify a mandate, a requirement, without worrying about bodily integrity or personal autonomy and civil liberties.
One audience member asked, you know, we have extremists who seem to be gaining ground on the local level across the country. So they're recruiting people through social media. They're using fear mongering. You have attacks on mask mandates, vaccine mandates, on school boards. We don't see any reason to believe this is slowing down. And the idea of engaging in sort of civil discourse and a communitarian interaction with these sort of extreme elements seems very far away. So to try to leave things on a positive note, where do you think we have where is there reason for optimism in this landscape, and how can we move forward in a more hopeful way? Carmel, do you want to start that one?
Sure. And I will say, here's where I think that a lot of Larry's work and thinking on what freedoms are is really inspiring. This moment is a moment that is going to change all of our thinking. In a way, I came of age during 9/11, and that really changed a lot of assumptions that I and people my age made about the world, about security, about America relative to other countries. And the COVID-19 pandemic experience is going to be even more so. And I think you can see that this is a time and opportunity where there's a lot of cultural ferment to rethink, okay, what does it mean to be a person in the world? I don't think that it's a coincidence that a lot of the racial justice conversations really got traction at the same time, because people were really thinking, almost everything I know about the world has been upended. Let me question it. And so what I would hope is that this is an opportunity to kind of reinvigorate public health a little bit, the way that it was in the 19th century, where there was the sense that the wolf is at the door for all of us. And so we need to move to have better sanitation in our cities, and we need to start vaccinating, and we need everybody to be healthy so that each individual can be healthy. I think in the 20th century, there was a lot of emphasis on healthcare and not all that much emphasis on public health, with a few isolated exceptions, for example, smoking and lung cancer. And I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has really brought public health back to the forefront. I have both a JD and an MPH, and I used to joke all the time that my MPH was for fun, that people hired me and wanted me in the room because I had a JD, and all of a sudden in the pandemic it flipped and people were like, oh, that JD is nice, but really you have an MPH? Like, come sit in on this group, help me write this thing. And so I would be excited if this opened the door to a new golden era of public health.
That's beautifully said, Carmel. Very beautifully said.
I don't know if I can muster out of my cranky world optimism, but I will say this. COVID did not create Donald Trump. Donald Trump and his movement and the Tea Party and those forces were well underway. COVID appeared in the middle of that and actually defeated Donald Trump. So there are probably two lessons broad. One is defeat COVID. That may help pull us back together if it really does get tamped down and under control. And as Larry hasn't had a chance to say, but I'll say it for him, we've got to do it worldwide, not just as a effort in the US to really achieve where we want to be. And I actually believe that if you build some bridges, fill some potholes, do some infrastructure, get that budget through, then the public will see what the value is of communitarianism. Right now, it's a little abstract, but I think that's key.
Well, thank you all for bringing your expertise to this conversation. It's been fascinating and edifying, and perhaps improbably even ending on an optimistic note. So thank you all very much, and I'll hand it back to Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Wonderful job moderating the conversation. And I love that we ended on an optimistic note. Actually, you know, we are, after all, a Jewish community center, and we are in two businesses. We are in the optimism business, and we are in the community business. And I've been sitting here listening to Carmel and Larry and Art, your wonderful conversation and comments, and so deeply appreciated by all of us at the JCC and and all of those who participated this evening. But I was sitting here thinking about something. I also happen to be a rabbi, and there's this expression that says "Kankan chadash malei yashan." There's a new vessel, but with some very old wisdom. and this new vessel of the challenges of COVID that we are facing, particularly around these culture wars. I've been sitting here thinking of Hillel, Rabbi Hillel, as each of you in your own way touched on this notion of individual responsibility and collective responsibility for the community. And Hillel was the one who said, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? And I have to have that personal sense of accountability. But if I am only for myself, then what am I? And to me, that piece of wisdom was so, in some ways, hanging over our conversation and thinking about the legal aspects, the medical aspects, the trust in science, and so many of the issues that all of you brought up this evening. So thank you for your enlightening work in general and your inspiring and interesting comments tonight. It was an education for all of us. So David, Art, Larry, and Carmel, thank you once again on behalf of the JCC, WGBH in Boston, and our audience. And to our audience, thank you. Stay tuned for our upcoming programs. We will be in touch, and have a great night.